recent times, many initiatives have developed against the presence of colonial monuments and other colonial vestiges. Statues of slaveholders, colonists, and racist leaders have been targeted, together with street names and other manifestations of the colonial past in contemporary cities. This video presents key moments from the first online seminar promoted in 2022 by the University of Padova and Monash University, which focused on Italian colonial legacies, challenging the collective representations of Italians as good people, and finally coming to terms with a denied history of racial violence. Memory is deeply embedded in power dynamics, and it is essential to listen to forms of knowledge and ways of remembering that are opposed to the epistemic practices of the dominant groups. The artistic work of Alessandra Ferrini, Valerio Ciriaci, and Justin Randolph Thompson offer relevant counter-memories that challenge white ignorance. Their dialogue with academics Alessandro Pes, Joseph Sciorra, and Angelica Pesarini showcases how new forms of counter-memories can support practices of transcultural placemaking and inspire and support anti-racist movements.
Just like to give you a bit more understanding of my positionality, where I work, and the fact that I do work on, specifically on colonial and fascist legacies, but I do that from positioning that I call as an insider and outsider, since I've been based in London for almost 2 decades, but I did grow up in Italy, and of course I do engage with Italy largely now due to my work. So first of all, today I'm going to talk about through a few projects, and they are under the umbrella of my PhD research, but they are sort of an offshoot and something that I started to think more and more recently in terms very much about how to talk about colonial violence. And that I think has been also prompted by some examples of, given the vacuum of the Italian education system and so on, and this scarce sort of awareness around these issues, and especially the colonial past, then there's often a reaction once people get accustomed to this, that often is translated into sort of relying on shock value images and so on, which never consider so much, or the audiences of these images and how these images do re-traumatize and so on. So there's always a sort of dialogue that is made for and within a white audience, really. The first project I would like to tell you a bit more about is a short film called Sight and Scene, and I'm just gonna ask Matteo to play the trailer now. This film was made thanks to Alessandro Volterra, who's a historian based in the University of Roma Tre. And while I was doing research in Rome around the topic of my PhD, which has to do with the meeting between Silvio Berlusconi and Muammar Gaddafi in Rome in 2009, I came across this this archive, which is held within Roma 3, that Alessandro actually directs, where there is this wide collection of the pictures of the capture and execution of Omar al-Mukhtar. At the time, this is recently changed because Alessandro managed finally with Maurizio Zinni to publish the research, but for a long time these images were sort of stuck in a copyright limbo and could not be published because the family of the fascist General Colonel Bedendo, who actually took the pictures and then his family donated it to the archive, never released the rights. So these images actually are the most comprehensive collection of images of that event, and were not publishable basically. So with Alessandro, we came to we did this little collaboration, because the first time I went to the archive, he had this really incredible storytelling where, you know, in 10 minutes it will take you through the 80 pictures, explain you why they're so important, and you know why I couldn't publish them as well. And so I did record him, and then he allowed me to film the images, but the whole film is a sort of play on, you know, what you can, I cannot see, because obviously we don't have the rights to show them, so we kind of played on a gray area, let's say, but also play with, you know, sort of also frustration of, you know, seeing and not seeing, and the question of how is storytelling actually can, you know, allow you to still form a picture in your, you know, in your mind. At the same time, this film features other reflections, and as you saw, the trailer, it begins with this reflection on actually images and, you know, the colonial, how the role of photography, especially in documentation within the colonial project. His research then really has taken me to looking a lot at the genocide that happened in Libya at the end of for the so-called pacification of Libya. So we're looking at the 20s, early 30s, which culminated very much with the capture and execution of Omar al-Mukhtar. And a lot of the question for me have been around how do we talk about this genocide, which is pretty much unknown, as you know, in Italy, in, you know, the general public, but also, you know, how do we do that without, again, like I mentioned before, re-traumatizing, and, you know, so how do I do that from my positioning as well. So I think there's always this fine line between educating a white audience and, you know, kind of and at the same time re-traumatizing basically the people who are already victim of this violence. So how do we think of that? And I think some of the projects we've seen, some of the sort of more activist attempts as well, like in Palermo, for instance, in trying to remind people about colonial violence, have been doing exactly that. They've been putting images of, you know, bodies that have been affected by mustard gas, for instance, or, you know, images of that to sort of play on that shock value. But I think that, you know, that's highly problematic. And to really conclude, I'd like to say that these reflections are now taken into this exhibition, which is opening next week in Bozen at Argekunst, which looks very much at these relations, is looking at different writers that have been trying to hide, to sort of unsettle and bypass the censorship that was around the documentation and circulation of documentation of the genocide. And this has translated in a work around people like Knud Olmboe, which was a Danish journalist, Leda Raffanelli, who was a writer, anarchist, Islamic, Muslim anarchist, feminist, and also the main focus of the exhibition, which is the translation of the Conscript, which is an anti-colonial a novel written by Ghebreyesus Aylu, and that was never translated until 2012 when it was translated into English from Tigrinya, and now we are translating it from the original Tigrinya into Italian.
Alessandra Ferrini's documentary and her work expresses the richness and the potential of the encounter between art and historical research. Her work highlights some crucial issues in the relationship between past and present that I too, in my way, try to question in my research. First of all, the many ways in which colonial history has been used to build new national identities in the post-colonial world. This process affected both post-1945 Italy, but also Libya, especially in the post-1969 years. My personal side unseen concerns the colonial past in the period in which it transforms from the present to the present past, and therefore in the period between the occupation of the Italian colonies by the British troops and the establishment in those territories of the British military administrations, so between 1942 and 1943, and the end of the Italian trusteeship in Somalia, so in 1960. Many perspectives and views can be taken to reconstruct and historically analyze this period. The perspective that I have used most is that of trying to understand if and how Italian colonialism was the subject of public discussion in the first Republican decades. Trying to identify which are the main actors who discuss it and what kind of discourse was built around the colonial past. I believe that the colonial past has been part and continues to be part of the Italian public debate. Even before the birth of the Italian Republic, the colonial question was present in the Italian public debate, introduced into the debate above all by the institutions and the refugees who returned, the so-called profughi d'Africa, who returned to the motherland after the occupation of the colonies. The colonial past cannot be considered, as often been written and said, like a removed page of the history of Italy and of the Italians. From 1945 onwards, the colonial past was talked about and written abundantly. What I think is important to point out is that since the publication of the first research, historical reconstruction, that challenged the myth of the Italian good colonizer, the validity of the myth in Italian society has not suffered any particular repercussion. It is interesting to note how much of the Italian vocabulary of decolonization reflects this dynamic coming precisely from the decolonizations of the others. The strength of the myth and the difficulty of deconstructing it resides, in my opinion, in two of its main features. The first is to be centered on the figure of the worker and the proletarian. Therefore, a myth from which all the violence related to the colonial dynamic is excluded. The second concerns its origin. We can indeed trace the roots of the myth to the colonial period, both in the liberal and fascist periods. The myth, however, undergoes a fundamental reconfiguration after the fall of fascism, in the period in which the first Italian democratic governments are trying to obtain the administration of the former colonies. In that period, a fundamental dichotomy takes shape between colonialism considered suitable, the liberal one, and a bad one, the fascist one.
Today I'm going to show just a little extract, a short extract of this upcoming documentary that I'm working on, entitled Stonebreaker. As you say, is a film about the recent fights over monuments in the United States. Basically, I was working before 2020, so before this the biggest battle of monuments started, I was working on a documentary about Christopher Columbus and the contested myth of Christopher Columbus. I guess when 2020 happened, of course, George Floyd was killed and the Black Lives Matter protest started. I just put the the project in standby at the moment. It didn't seem like relevant. It seems like the war with the pandemic as well was changing a lot. And then of course I didn't have to wait too long before that project became very relevant again, because as you all know, the protest, the Black Lives Matter protest, began to target also historical monuments, and how America remembers his past became the center of this public discourse. And so yes, this project became super relevant again, but at that point I decided to expand the project beyond Columbus to talk about also other monuments, other contested monuments, because it wasn't just Columbus. It was also this Confederate statue in the South, and we in the film, so we kind of wanted to embrace this wider scope, and we began filming. Me and Isaac Lipsin, the producer, cinematographer of the project, we began traveling around the United States to capture this, those actions around monuments that were happening. So we have the Northeast, of course, Columbus being the center of this contested monument. We traveled to, as I mentioned, to the South. In this case, we went to Richmond, Virginia, where the Monument Avenue and the Confederate Monument or Monument Avenue were completely transformed, covered on graffiti. And then we traveled even to South Dakota, and we filmed Mount Rushmore and the fights, the indigenous fight, the Lakota's fight around Mount Rushmore that happened around the same time during a visit by President Trump. So those are just, just a little example of all those vignettes that we collected throughout the country in this 1.5 years of time. I guess the idea was to size this zeitgeist of this last couple of years, and, but we really hope by adding all those vignettes together, by comparing them, contrasting them, we hope we can push on a reflection on public memorialization. So what does it mean to remember? What do we remember? What we do not? I guess there was a lot of the debate around this monument. We hear a lot of the phrase of that what was happening was with monuments, and the removal of monuments was that we were witnessing an erasing of history. And that's something that we've been kind of hearing, we heard a lot throughout this film. I guess what's the biggest big giveaway from this journey that we had was that we actually witnessed the opposite of erasing history. We really saw those monuments that sometimes we didn't even notice walking around our city. Finally, we see them waking up. Kind of the aura of untouchability has been shattered. And what we see from those cracks, right, are darkest chapter of US history that not necessarily we talk about it here. And what we see as well is this also the history of the oppressed one and the people who resisted. And so I think that's again the biggest giveaway is this, to see how people got activated by the past in past years. They really got galvanized, and that kind of galvanized, yes, the fights on the present for present day change.
I think it's particularly important from my perspective that conversations around Italy, Italian colonization, are also including the Italian diaspora and the ways in which whiteness and colonization are also playing out in places like the United States and around commemorations of Columbus. Within the Italian American community, there's this perspective that Italian as working class immigrants arriving in the United States in the great wave of immigration of the late 19th century, early 20th century, were in a country that was anti-immigrant, anti-worker, anti-Catholic, and specifically anti-Italian. That Italian immigrants were, and by by default Italian Americans in the 21st century. The relationship with Italy is an important one because in 1920, the Italian Parliament passed a resolution that was introduced by Representative Fitzgerald Nizzoli that pushes the Italian government on the political and diplomatic front to safeguard Columbus in the United States. That charge is now part of the Italian government's mission. And so that this relationship is not one that's simply confined to the United States, but now incorporates Italy into this, this work of defending Columbus here in this country. The work that I've been doing around Columbus and the Italian Americans' engagement with Columbus monuments in particular at a time of decolonization has been going on now for several years with my colleague Laura Roberto. We've initiated a number of research projects, publications, blog posts, as well as a No Columbus Day campaign, which we initiated with other colleagues in 2017, which was a group of scholars who petitioned the Italian American representatives in Congress to do away with Columbus Day. And that initiative was part of a long-standing work that has been done within the Italian American community as anti-racist, anti-Columbus, and decolonization efforts, which I think is often subsumed by the louder voices from those representatives and the meme that we just showed, who have the political clout, who have the monetary resources to wage national and in the case with the passage in the parliament in Italy, international campaign on behalf of Columbus. And I just want to list some organizations of the past and the present which have been active in as Italian Americans, identifying as Italian Americans, but understanding their relationship to whiteness, decoupling ethnic identity from the image of Columbus, and working in partnership with other communities, historically going back to 1992, and particularly Italian Americans for a Multicultural United States here in New York City. In San Francisco in 1999, there was the Italian American Political Solidarity Club, which worked with Native Americans on the West Coast in opposition to Columbus. In Denver, in 2004, emerged the group called Progressive Italians Transforming the Columbus Holiday. And then today, we have a number of young activists, which are not only taking to the streets, but taking to the internet in a number of different ways. There's the Philly Radical Italian Network out of Philadelphia, the Italian American Heritage Society of Chicago, and Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day out of Boston. What we've tried to do is, in fact, to uncover the past and to see the ways in which Italian American identity was formed and harnessed to the Columbus myth. And so Italian Americans, it's a long sort of a maxim that Italian immigrants discovered Columbus when they come to the United States, because Columbus is in fact an American hero, a mythic hero that goes all the way back to Revolutionary days. And I won't get into the sort of complicated history and ways in which that happens, but the idea that we have Columbia University is very much tied to Columbus and the image, the female image of Columbia, which was an effort to distance the United States from England and in some cases from Europe, but quickly became tied to Manifest Destiny and the ways of moving west and the service of genocidal practices in the United States. It wasn't the Italian American buy-in to Columbus was not a bottom-up initiative, but was very much a top-down initiative in which a handful of Italian immigrant elites, who have historically been known as prominenti, the prominent ones, understood that Columbus as an American hero was a way to raise the level of Italian imagery in the United States. Italian immigrants who at the time, at the late 19th century, early 20th century, did suffer incredible amounts of bigotry and racism by the white Anglo-Saxon elites. But they did so with the notion, of course, of promoting a very specific Italian identity, that of the elite Renaissance high art factors of Italian identity. And so by doing so, right, they dismiss and dismantle the sort of popular working class culture and the representations of Italian immigrants at that time and how they sought to see themselves, and in their immediacy of their everyday lives, with this very sterilized, very elite and highly racialized aspect of Italian identity. And so though that history is one that contemporary Italian American leadership who speak on the behalf of Italian Americans sort of don't want to engage with. So that there were moments in the 1930s in which Columbus rallies, this sort of supposedly benign ethnic expression of Italian ethnicity, was in fact rallies for fascists in the United States dressed in black shirt and offering Roman salutes in the name of Columbus. And so that these parts of the stories are of the Columbus mythology in its relationship to Italian Americans is part of what Laura, Roberto, and I have tried to do in our research as a way to say, if you want to talk about history and you want to talk about the dismantling or the destruction of history, we really need to have a deeper conversation, in fact, about the relationship of Italian Americans. Interesting sort of fact, and I'll just read here some information, is that there's a wonderful site about Columbus monuments by a scholar called Peter van der Krook. It's just a really rich source for Columbus monuments all over the world. So I made a calculation of all the Columbus monuments, busts, statues that existed in the United States. There was approximately 212 of them, and 50 were inaugurated between 1890s and the 1940s, while 161 were installed between the 1950s and 2000, with 55 alone created in the 1990s for the 500th anniversary of Columbus's landing in the Caribbean. Which is to say that these Columbus monuments, the vast majority of these Columbus monuments, are not made at the time when Italian immigrants are being attacked in print and in the streets of the United States, sometimes even lynched, as we know, not during that time, but in fact, in response to a white ethnic movement, a specifically time-specific era of post-1970s. Here we are in the 1990s, when the critiques of Columbus already are known because of the work of the indigenous community here in the United States, and they become a representation of whiteness under the veil of Italian ethnicity. And so these aspects of history are the ones that I think are important if we're going to be speaking about Columbus monuments, its relationship to Italy, and notions of whiteness and colonization.
I think, in general, the idea of working through monuments, really rethinking monuments, monumental histories, and what it means to preserve our history through these objects In the introduction, the idea of the arrogance of permanence was mentioned, and this is something I'm quite fixated with. And I think right now I'm in the United States. I'm working on a project that I was funded for through Creative Capital. And it's a project that is called Surveying Gravity, and it's dedicated to my grandfather. But it's a project that actually emerged through the fact that the University of Massachusetts decided to name their Fine Arts Center after my grandfather, Randolph Bromley. And this choice really disturbed me in a certain sense. I was very happy and sort of the celebration and honor of that, but also very aware of the ways in which monuments typically are not capable of holding histories. And they are also very capable of flattening those histories, and then also notions of preservation through time and what it means for different things to happen in a space that carries a name. So I've been very interested in that. And it's an ongoing film project that I actually started about 10 years ago, shooting various fragments. And it was really, it was inspired by the footage that you see here. This is 2 images that come from my grandfather's archive, that just home video shots are great. But as he was involved in geological survey, amongst other things, there's these layerings of home video that show my mother, my uncles, and then other footage that shows sort of flying on planes and sort of surveying the geological territories. And I've been really interested in the layerings and the complexities of these histories, also because my grandfather, his mother was an Italian orphan from Parma. And so there's these sort of layerings in my being as an African-American in Italy, what it means to be looking back at this legacy, also within my family specifically, where one of the only, actually perhaps the only white ancestor that I'm aware of in our family blood is Italian, and sort of what that means, what that signifies, how do we enact those things. But Minted in Enemy Bronze, we can go on to the next image, has been carried out as a way of actually going to various sites that hold on to history and challenging those sites through, first and foremost, an interaction with a number of people who have been important to my journey and my thinking on Black history. And then also through certain archival traces that have been pulled to the surface. The image that you see here is 2 different stills from a film called Don't You Tell No One I Made It, in which the 2 boxers that you see, one is Leonard Bundu, who is an Italian welterweight champion past, and the other is Josef Tekle, who's a young boxer who's in training right now. And I invited them to come together and to actually meet each other for the very first time, because I thought it would be beneficial and fruitful. But I invited them to meet each other beneath this triumphal arch, which is in Piazza della Libertà in Florence, which is, not an ancient triumphal arch, but it certainly has all the imagery that comes from Roman colonial history. So looking at Roman gods at the top of it, but also trophies of war, enchained slaves, the classic sort of 4 Moors chained at the top of this. And this is a monument that I've been in dialogue with since I first moved to Italy. And this film consists of the 2 of them sort of shadow boxing back to back, in a certain sense, protecting each other and certainly resisting any possibility of triumphal passage through the arch. I was really interested in just sort of what it means to sort of occupy that space, also in dialogue with a number of different texts. So while they're boxing, there's actually a voiceover that is Antonello Bundu, who is a city council representative in Florence, also the first Black mayoral candidate in Florence, who is reading actually a preface from a book by Ferdinando Martini, who, amongst other things, was a governor of the Eritrean colony. And he was, in his preface, basically trying to state the reasons why he decided to use 2 Fs in writing Africa. And so it's sort of a defense of his position in regards to defining Africa. This is in a book that's called Cose Africane, African Things. And so I was really interested in the sort of layering of this image and this text together and what it could say. We can go on to the next image. The film itself, Minted in Enemy Bronze, is born from actually a pendant that was from the unification of Italy that had on the back of it the writing Coniato in Bronzo Nemico, Minted in Enemy Bronze. And I was very interested I'm interested in material history and the ways in which the bronze, like who was the enemy of that bronze? Where did it come from? Did it come from statuary? Did it come from ammunition? And in what ways does it still hold on to those previous lives? And so that's been sort of this idea of sort of taking these histories and the traces even once they've been transformed and really rethinking them. The image that you see here is from colonial postage stamps. And I used these to actually create, this was around 2003, to create a series of brass mirrors. These were mirrors inspired by Roman and Etruscan mirrors that usually would have deities inscribed on the back of them and then would have a polished reflective surface on the other side. And I wanted to sort of think about the ways in which the legacy of colonial history extending all the way back into antiquity is sort of picked up in multiple moments of Italian history, through the history on Italian territory. And so I actually etched the image that you see here onto a series of these mirrors to sort of think about self-reflection, self-implication, but at the same time also the ways in which these postage stamps want to construct a certain image of Italianness and of the Italian colonies that has been orchestrated through propaganda. Around the organization of Black History Month Florence, which I co-founded in 2016, and which developed into the Recovery Plan in 2019. But it did so by thinking about research platforms and different ways of thinking about the archive and archival history. And so in 2018, we created a research platform, our very first, which is called Black Archive Alliance, which was dedicated to looking at archival traces inside private and public archives within the context of Florence in its first year. It was a project done with Villa Romana that was about sort of mapping the city, bringing to the surface research that had already been happening in various archives in relation to Africa, and then also really trying to think about what an archive actually means. So going also into some personal homes and working with the objects that they had. And really it was about stimulating a certain kind of debate. You can move to the next slide, which sort of breaks down a little bit of some of the process. And so we worked with 20 different spaces in the first iteration. We created a display format for making accessible some of the research that we were doing, and also for creating a sort of display format that could be exported and transported to various people. And so have that possibility of loaning this information. We did tours inside a number of these different archives to sort of think about what it means to access these spaces, which are typically off limits to everyone except for scholars. And then also to really go back into these spaces and think about their historic memory and meaning. You can go to the next slide. These are just some images from where some of the spaces that we were in. And these are some of the things that were emerging. So, when it comes to looking at Black history in the context of Italy, you're always looking at a history that is extensive, incredibly layered and complex. And I think that one of the ways in which we can talk about these histories of violence without re-traumatizing is about injecting back into them the complexity and nuance that they deserve. And so these are fragments of looking at everything from the Uffizi galleries and portraiture that they have there to collections of contemporary art, onto a personal archive connecting to a space like the Sahara Desert, which was a Black-run recreational space in Florence. We can go to the next slide. In the first iteration of it, we sort of charted these different spaces and sites, but we also sort of looked at various histories that occupied space in Florence, even for temporary moments. And so this image is of Leopold Senghor, the then president of Senegal, who was giving a speech at Palazzo Vecchio about the role of Senegal and the role of Africa in providing Europe with a deeper and further reaching humanity. So I was interested in the sort of ways in which this shows up in the archive, the way in which it's recorded through Giorgio Lapira, a man who's known as the mayor's saint. We can go to the next image. And I will sort of close with these next couple images. Black Archive Alliance, we sort of decided to sort of take this research platform and shift it a couple times. So the second time we did it, we brought together a number of mentors to work with students at various institutions on research and archives as a way of extending the conversations that have been opened through the very first iteration of it. And actually, Angelica Pesarini was one of the mentors who worked with students at New York University Florence on history connected to the Istituto Agronomico Oltremare. She was also involved in the very first edition of Black Archive Alliance, doing research into Italian postage stamps and postcards from colonial history. And you can go to the next image there, which basically shows some of the ways in which we were able to develop actually a common conversation and a student-run conference to share the research. And then we sort of developed other research formats and exhibition formats, which are in the next slide. And so this is a growing platform. This is an image of the conference. And in the next slide, you can see an image of some of the installations. There you go. And you can just scroll through these last images. These are just installations that we've done in various sites to look at ways of displaying and holding on to not the archives themselves, but the research that emerged. And I think in our third edition, we worked really instead with researchers to put them in dialogue with artists and to sort of think about the sort of sharing that could happen. In fact, in that process, we had brought together a group of young artists of African descent for a research residency, and we connected them to researchers of African descent to be in dialogue with them. And Angelica Pesarini was paired up with Binta Diao to sort of think about also the history and representation of labor. The image that you see here is sort of the contemporary iteration that we have of Black Archive Alliance, which is an ongoing collection of various fragments of different moments of history from the contemporary. What you see here is images that come from the hunger strike that took place in Florence in 1990, organized by members of the Senegalese community. And I think there might be one last slide. And that is really for closing. And so I will sort of take this moment just to hand over to Angelica Pesarini, who through our sort of interaction also in the third volume of Black Archive Alliance, really worked with us also to really think about the ways in which everything that's not held within the archive might be able to be brought to the surface through that direct dialogue with people, and might be helpful in our rethinking of the archive itself, its validity, the ways in which it tends to sort of keep things and exclude other things, and the ways in which individuals doing this research represent another form of archive.
I'm working now specifically on this idea of archives because talking about family connection is like if there are two archives, there is a familiar archive in which we hear certain stories. And then there is an institutional archive in which the stories are not there. And so there is this sort of clash in which you try to figure out what is the missing link, what are these gray areas in which so much is happening but is not seen, right? So going back to Alessandra, seen and unseen, when we go into archive, written or not written, heard or not heard. So it's really interesting how in the archive, I think sometimes it's more interesting what we don't see. What is in between the lines, but it's not clear. And so I was telling you about this work in which we follow Charles Mill's theorization, and where we realize that the denial of certain historical facts is made possible and perpetuated by what Mills defined the management of memory. And I think this is a very important concept because collective and social memories not only provide the framework for individual memories, but also closely connected with systems of knowledge production. And so Mills argues that social memory is learned, is not neutral, is not natural, but is learned, is inscribed in textbooks, and it is emphasized and made present in the everyday life through ceremonies, national holidays, statues, and monuments. So it's interesting to think, what do we remember? What the state teach us to remember. And memory, like identity, is not a fixed entity, but rather a representation of reality embedded in dynamics of class, gender, and power relation that determine, how Mill says, what is remembered or forgotten, by whom, and for what end. And we can argue that memory, as I was saying, is not a neutral fact, but is deeply embedded in these power dynamics. And collective memory is always divisive because those in power systematically seek to suppress subaltern memory, or what he calls counter memory. And so the frictions caused by conflicting memories produce opposite perception of what had happened or not, what is important to remember or not. And the visibility of racialized counter-memories in the post-George Floyd era in Europe clearly have challenged hegemonic white amnesias, and this is still an ongoing debate. So, as I was saying, Toronto, I moved to Toronto in November, and going around with my lens, obviously what I notice is a lot of colonial heritage. Having lived in the UK for 10 years, I was kind of anesthetized to this representation of royal families and the monarchy. I have to say, coming in Toronto, it was a bit shocking to see how the management of memory, how much memory is pushed toward a certain history. And so near the university, there is this huge statue of Queen Victoria. One of the first things I saw when I went to visit the campus. There are some specific characters like Ryerson and Dundas. And for me, these were anonymous names. But then I realized what is the importance of the legacy they left, and how the city and activists are trying to change that. At the same time, Canada is also was born out of a project of extermination. And so I will tell you about that in a moment. So there are these neoliberal practices that try to show how progressive is Canada, this multiculturalism. But if you dig a bit, you see in reality how capitalism is really a fundamental factor controlling what is remembered and what is not remembered. What is interesting, though, is that there is also a lot of resistance. And this is something that also impressed me. Walking around the city, almost on a daily basis, I discover new anti-colonial, I see anti-colonial artistic work. And so just on Sunday, actually, I was walking near the Lake Ontario, and I saw these images, and I was having a look, Rentihorn Mountains. And so I went a bit closer, and I discovered this fantastic artist, Sasha Huber, Swiss Haitian. She worked on this project calling Demounting Agassiz. So who was Agassiz? Agassiz was a Swiss-born naturalist and glaciologist, very, very famous. He made some impressive achievements, but as Sasha Huber also points out, he was an influential racist and pioneering thinker of apartheid. And the specific area in which I was a time a sort of hill that was called Agassiz Hill. Now, this has been renamed in Rentihorn. Renti was a Congolese-born enslaved woman, and he was as I said, he was a thinker and a promoter of apartheid and slavery. And so he ordered that Renti would be photographed on a South Carolina plantation to prove the inferiority of the Black race. And so now, on that area of Toronto near the wall, there is this work that she managed to create, but also that was put permanently on that specific street of Toronto in remembrance of Rentihorn. You can see her work on her website, and is really, really fascinating. Also, Egerton, Ryerson. I live just nearby Ryerson University, and Ryerson I didn't know who he was. When I read his biography, yeah, it's quite impressive, in the amount of things he achieved, including designing the Canada school residential school system. As you may have heard, when I arrived was quite brutal, because hundreds of bodies were discovered in Canada, children killed, died while living in this residential school designed by Egerton Ryerson. And for me, this was quite painful in a way, because these residential schools are very similar to the boarding schools that the colonial Italian colonial government set up in East Africa. And going back to this familiar and institutional archive, well, my grandmother was one of the children put into this residential school, into this boarding school in Somalia. She was telling me how her mother didn't have much choice. And this was similar to the residential school in Canada, although here was more systematic. Kids were abducted by their families in order to become Canadian, especially Métis people. Métis people is a group of First Nation people who were mixed, and so more prone to be transformed into perfect Europeans. And so many buildings are named after Egerton Ryerson. He put a lot of money into education. That's why there was a university named after him, because a few days ago, Ryerson University, who was called X University among many, has just changed the name, and so is now Toronto Metropolitan University. This was huge. And so it happened literally a few days ago. So it's still a very heated debate. But also there is another name that I didn't put here, Dundas, and he also was a slave owners, and he also was involved in residential school. I live in Dundas Street, and so there is also this idea to change all the name of streets named after Dundas. So millions of dollars have been put there. I don't know if I would talk about authentic way or replacing memories, because what I think is that authenticity and truth are words that have been kind of co-opted by hegemonic ways of thinking and hegemonic ways of remember, precisely to tell us there is one memory, there is one truth. And so I think in what I do in my practices is within academia and outside academia is a bit to break the ways in which we produce knowledge, or mainly how to dismantle a bit what is counted as knowledge. So what is knowledge? Knowledge is also it's not just what we read in history textbooks, for example. It's what I was saying earlier about the archive. There were stories in my family that were real, but I didn't read these stories on the books I was studying as a student while talking about Italian colonialism, an experience that I barely studied in school, but it was so fundamental for me. And so how can we bring these voices, these little voices of history, as Ranaji Gupta called them, so important, because they counterbalance, actually. I think they challenge these dominant historiographies and management of memory. And so I think, for example, In my case, the methods I use to conduct research and to produce knowledge have been really fundamental. Black feminist epistemologies. Black feminists have helped me a lot to rethink myself, to reposition myself in the debate, in the field work when I write, forcing me to be self-reflexive. So who am I? From what position I speak, and especially to recognize that we are all situated nowheres. None of us holds the real story. There are stories, plural, and I think it's really important to collect this story. So that's why oral history for me is so fundamental, because it's a way to hear also these voices that are often considered not qualified enough to be counted as knowledge.
One aspect of it, and to talk about, again, from the Italian-American context, not necessarily an anti-racist one per se, but the need for a constant recovery and re-examination of the past that has been historically erased. Again, from the Italian-American context, we know now, and we knew a century ago, a history that had been erased with the white ethnic movement, that in which Italian radicals, socialists, communists, anarchists, who were fighting for workers' rights across ethnic lines, across racial lines, and who, at some of them, were, back in the early part of the 20th century, spoke and wrote specifically against Columbus. That the need to recover and reclaim and document those histories in the context of a larger American history, I think is really critical to the work that scholars above and beyond myself have been doing for the past 20 and 30 years, because it is just those contemporary spokespeople who, in their mythologizing of the immigrant past, have erased those struggles of working class people and their relationship to connections to other communities. And so I think just at the very basic level, the need for, in this case, scholars to be doing that really hard work of not only uncovering that material, but then bringing it to local fora of various sources. And one of the things that we do at the Calandra Institute is that we have public events in which we invite scholars, artists, to present this work, to complicate and diversify what's understood as the Italian-American experience, a singular event where, in fact, it is a multiple, complicated, varied history.
What started was through a conversation about positionality, and it was asking if positionality, sometimes it seems to be the only conversation. And I know that I think I know where that perception comes from, but I think it's actually really, really crucial to recognize the importance of positionality in relation to all of this work. How important it is to really think about where we're coming from when we're speaking to things, the realities that we carry with us, our own perspectives and vantage points are so key to having any of these conversations and to rendering any level of complexity to it. So I think it's really crucial. And it's actually, I don't think it's that frequent that positionality is brought forth outside of those who are really doing activist-based work and who are doing scholarly research in trying to sort of combat some of the things that have been written historically. I think it's much less frequent that you find positionality from the point of view of those who are really writing these histories and holding on to certain narratives, because there's an assumption that those things are simply universal. So I think that the importance of positionality is really in getting beyond that and understanding that every one of those narratives, every one of those historiographies has a very specific anchor that when we don't acknowledge it, we don't understand a lot of things about what's being said.
I completely agree about the question of positionality, and I think a lot of the time is used as a sort of wash away all sin kind of practice. And obviously when it's just done that in a very performative way, as Angelica was mentioning before, then obviously that is the limits and the real risk of engaging with positioning ourselves. Going back to what I was mentioning before, I think in Italy there is not a real tradition of doing that and owning up to our whiteness and those privileges, and also owning up to the privileges that we have as academics, for instance, because being an academic in Italy is so precarious. And I often hear people telling me, yes, well, call it a privilege, but, and I think, there's a lot of, and this is, I think, is also related to the way we are not able to talk about class as well. And so how that kind of take over in kind of, refusing certain kind of accountability. And that talking about accountability goes on with some other question that I always bring out when I talk about making this kind of work in Italy as as an artist, is who holds me accountable for what I say, because most of the rooms I talk to are white, and they are not only white, but also they don't know much about the colonial past. So the discourse is always very, very superficial. Going back to what Alessandro was mentioning before, is always, the colonial past was removed, and and now it's not my fault. There's a lot of kind of shifting responsibility and accountability with that narrative. And that brings me back to the fact as well of talking about family history and heritage and where our wealth come from, which is something else that is not really talked about. And if we also link back up to the history of the Italian diaspora, there's a lot of other questions to do with the fascistizations of Italians abroad, for instance, that are not really talked about. And also the position that we take up as migrants, or Italians abroad, because like this is the difference as well in how we call ourselves, and that again is to do with class and whiteness. And so it's often not talked about or problematized, and all of that are issues that you find now with at the center of a huge problem for me, which is how in Italy we are talking about decolonizing without any understanding of where that word come from, as a genealogy and as the kind of militant and revolutionary and radical meaning of it, but it's kind of completely whitewashed, really. And this is one of my main issues, which is why I tend to be very careful using the word as well. And again, is always because it's a discourse made about audience that is not really versed in a lot of this kind of conversations as well, and vocabulary as well, and also doesn't speak amongst a group that can hold them accountable. And I think Angelica wrote amazingly about the protests around the Black Lives Matter in 2020, and how the Italian activists, so we're talking about as well activism, Italian white activism is very problematic in the way it looks at race, and how they reacted to Black Lives, the riots in the US without being able to absolutely translate that to Italy. And I think for me, my lived experience is very quite poignant for me, how I got to find out about Italian colonialism in London just by pure accident, because I lived with someone who was fleeing the war in Libya. Otherwise I would have never known somehow, even studying post-colonial studies in Britain, because also how imperialism is talked about is always very fragmentary, and Italian imperialism is always seen as completely marginal to even the history of the European imperialism.